China had an appalling year for human rights in 2020. That's according to a Human Rights Watch report. The advocacy group cited the crackdown on dissent in Hong Kong, repression of Muslim Uighurs, and the silencing of people reporting on the coronavirus outbreak.
Human Rights Watch released its annual report on human rights conditions worldwide. According to the advocacy group, human rights abuses have worsened in every aspect of Chinese society. Human Rights Watch said the abuse have worsened since President Xi Jinping came into power in 2012, and the space for an independent thinking or activity has shrunk.
The general trend is obvious. Since President Xi Jinping came to power, the repression has gone worse and worse. Overall, like on every aspect of the Chinese society, you can see how the party is becoming more and more intolerant of any kind of like independent activity, whether it's in the academia, in the press, on the internet, civil society groups. It's just like there are less and less opportunity for any kind of dependence activity that is independent from what the state wants.
On the United States, Human Rights Watch Executive Director Kenneth Roth said outgoing President Donald Trump had 4 years of abuse of democratic principles.
To sum it up, Donald Trump was a disaster for human rights. His flouting of human rights at home and his embrace of friendly autocrats around the world severely eroded U.S. credibility on human rights.
Well, we're now joined by Human Rights Watch Executive Director Kenneth Roth, and he joins us via Zoom from Geneva in Switzerland. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. It is significant that a global report on human rights, you talk quite a bit about the role that the United States should have played in terms of defending human rights, both at home and abroad, and also Donald Trump.
Well, yes. When Human Rights Watch issues our annual world report this time of year, we always introduce it with a big global theme. And that theme varies from year to year. This year, we felt compelled to write about the presidential transition in the United States. And as I mentioned in that brief clip, we recognize that Donald Trump was an unmitigated disaster when it came to human rights. At home, he fomented racism, he attacked immigrants, he, undermined the right to vote, and he threatened very, democratic society in the United States. He attacked the ability to count the votes and determine who the next president's going to be. So those were the outrages at home. And then around the world, he just, there wasn't a friendly autocrat he didn't want to cozy up to. So he would occasionally criticize perceived adversaries. So Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, by the end, China. But he had no credibility in doing that because it wasn't a principled approach to human rights. It was a very politically convenient approach. And so our big question we had posed is, what can Joe Biden do to redeem some U.S. credibility on human rights? And we made a few recommendations to Biden. I think one of the ones, kind of an interesting one to begin with, is that while Trump withdrew from the defense of human rights, other governments recognized that human rights were too important to abandon just because Trump did. And so we saw many governments come to the fore and assume leadership roles in important ways on human rights. And you could see this, in Latin America, for example, where traditionally governments there don't criticize each other's human rights record. That completely changed in the last 4 years. There was a group of Latin American democracies that took on Venezuela and later Nicaragua and were very effective. We saw this with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the 56 Muslim majority nations, who took the lead in defending the Rohingya Muslims facing persecution in Myanmar. In Africa, tiny Gambia played an incredible leadership role. They brought a genocide case to the World Court on behalf of the Rohingya. And South Africa played a very useful role as well, leading an effort to investigate systemic racism, particularly in policing in the United States and around the world. And they were also at the forefront of efforts to promote distribution of the coronavirus vaccine. So one of our recommendations to Biden is, look at all these new governments have come to the fore. There are many more defenders of human rights. That makes for a more robust, stronger defense. Join them. Don't try to replace them. You should be a partner with them, but not suddenly put yourself in front of them as the supposed leader. So that was one very big recommendation to the Biden administration.
So, like it or not, I guess when a superpower doesn't defend human rights robustly and perhaps sets a bad example, it does encourage some dictators and poorer democracies to perform badly as well.
That's completely the case. And I think that particularly this awful attack that Trump fomented last week on the Capitol, as the senators and representatives were literally counting the votes for who the next president's going to be, that's going to be Exhibit A for people like Putin or Xi Jinping, as they say, democracy is too messy. Just go with my stable dictatorship. Now, we realize that that's a false argument, that dictatorships are brittle. I mean, you were talking just earlier about China, and you had one of my colleagues describing the intense crackdown that has taken place in China under Xi Jinping. This is not an act of confidence. This is a president who's afraid of his own people, who doesn't want to let them speak out freely, doesn't want to give them free access to information, doesn't want them to even meet to discuss how the government's doing. This all terrifies him. And so that's not stability. The dictator can certainly use an iron fist and keep the lid on for a while, but it's an explosive situation. And our experience has been that, particularly in the midst of the pandemic, where you want governments that don't serve themselves, but serve the people, it's absolutely essential to have a free flow of information and free public debate about how the government is doing. So to give an example of where this can go wrong, in Egypt, where again, you've got a very autocratic government, President Sisi basically had a military coup to gain power. He was silencing doctors who criticized his response to the coronavirus. Why was he doing that? Well, because he was diverting money that was available to the army, which are his backers, and away from hospitals, which are absolutely decrepit in Egypt. And of course, the doctors wanted to complain about that. But when they are censored, the public ends up being worse off because, a dictator doesn't serve public health foremost. A dictator serves himself. And you can even go back to, the origins of the pandemic in Wuhan, in China, a year ago. And, for 3 weeks, the Chinese government censored the doctors who were trying to warn us. The Chinese government line at the time was all the cases of the coronavirus emanate directly from the market. And that turned out not to be true. People were spreading it person to person. There was human-to-human transmission. The doctors tried to warn us of that, but the Chinese government didn't want us to know. They were trying to suppress that bad news. And so for 3 weeks, they pretended there was no human-to-human transmission. During that time, millions of people fled Wuhan, 3,500 a day traveled internationally, and suddenly we have a global pandemic. So again, it shows you that if you suppress the free flow of information, you may serve the dictator, but you don't serve the public. It's a very dangerous system of government.
All right, so we're going to speak a bit more specifically about some countries, particularly here in Africa, but globally, if you compare year on year, what is the state of human rights on our planet? Are things getting worse, or is it the same, and it's the same usual suspects that keep coming up on the worst list?
Well, it's so difficult to speak globally about trends because obviously things get better in some countries and worse in others. But I guess two positive things that I would mention. One I just alluded to, which is that there is this stronger, broader, more global defense of human rights. And we see that, even in the number of governments who are willing to criticize China, which is skyrocketing over the last year. It used to be governments who were afraid to do that, fearful of economic retaliation. Now they're banding together, finding safety in numbers, and we find growing numbers willing to do that. But I think the real movement over the last year was on the streets at the popular level. And we've seen, people literally, marching in the street to defend human rights, to defend democracy in places like Hong Kong, Thailand, Belarus, Poland, Russia, the United States with the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, this was a growing global phenomenon. And I take real heart from that because it shows that, human rights are not abstractions. Human rights are things that people are really willing to sacrifice at least their freedom and sometimes even their lives in order to secure. So that, I think, is a real positive development over the last year. And this despite the constraints of the pandemic, despite the difficulties of going on the streets in the midst of a fast-spreading virus.
What's been your reading of the continent of Africa? 54 states, different states of being in terms of human rights abuses, sometimes sadly at the hands of the authorities themselves. I mean, I think about a story we've done this evening, social media platforms being shut down in Uganda. I mean, this is deprivation of a basic right, and that's to communicate.
Well, I mean, it's not only that, because, yes, you have an absolute right to be speaking to each other, particularly the day before an election. Tomorrow are the presidential and parliamentary elections in Uganda. So what really worries me is, why is President Museveni shutting down social media? Why does he not want people talking to each other? What is he planning for tomorrow? And we've seen that, this has been a really ugly campaign from the government's perspective. First, the president cited the pandemic to prevent his main challenger, the musician turned politician Bobby Wine, from campaigning. And so routinely police would go and shut down his campaign rallies, ostensibly because of the pandemic, but they didn't do the same thing for rallies in support of Museveni, the existing president. It got so bad that the police were beating people. They at one point shot a whole bunch of people at a Bobby Wine rally. And, Bobby Wine, the candidate, ended up campaigning with, a helmet and a bulletproof vest. Can you imagine? That's how a presidential candidate, the leading presidential candidate, has to campaign because of the violence of the police. So I'm very worried about what's going to happen tomorrow. Certainly, if you judge by just the outpouring in the street, there's enormous support for Bobby Wine. But are we going to have a fair balloting? Are we going to have a peaceful election? Or is Museveni planning something violent, which is why he's shutting down social media? So I'm very worried about what's going on there. And tomorrow is going to be a very big day for Uganda. Museveni's been in power for more than 30 years. It's not clear that he's willing to countenance a free and fair election to determine whether he stays in power.
It's very difficult when the authorities are the perpetrators of these abuses. Because where do citizens go? I think about the notorious SARS police unit in Nigeria that, did not distinguish itself. We see journalists being arrested for writing about corruption in countries like Zimbabwe. It's not encouraging when the authorities themselves are the ones that can be pointed to for human rights abuses.
Well, I mean, the truth of the matter, Peter, is it usually is the people in power who use human rights violations to stay in power. So, I mean, you take the example of SARS, this special anti-robbery squad that was notorious for summary executions in Nigeria. And, I mentioned how people came to the street to defend their rights. There were big demonstrations in Nigeria against SARS because of, one, its brutality, but two, its impunity. They got away with this. And it took, these big demonstrations to get the government to even announce that it was going to disband SARS. Very unclear that it's actually going to do that. But people were so outraged that they did stand up for their rights. And the government, ultimately was forced to respond. And Zimbabwe is a sad case because, Emerson Mnangagwa came into office and promised, a new Zimbabwe. This was not going to be Mugabe 2. This is going to be something different. And he's been a huge disappointment. He really has just continued the repressive, corrupt ways of his predecessor. And so, even though, again, the Zimbabwean people absolutely want their rights, they want democracy, he has, once more, just like his predecessor, used brutality to prevent them from exercising those rights. So, in these situations, it's all the more important for other governments to come to the fore. And, this is where I think South Africa has a very important role to play throughout the continent and even more broadly in the world. Because, we've seen South Africa over the last year, deploy special envoys for Zimbabwe, for South Sudan, for various countries that are in need. But South Africa is a very influential voice in the region. And I'd love to see it be more outspoken in defense of the people who you're talking about, the people whose rights are being trampled upon because the government is more interested in staying in power. And it takes pressure from the international community, pressure from democratic, powerful states like South Africa to make a real difference in these countries.
Kenneth Roth, we could talk for great length about this Human Rights Watch report for 2021. But people can download it on your website and read all 386 pages of it. But I think
we'll test them tomorrow. Yes,
it's a good indication for us about what's happening around us, and perhaps something we should pay more attention to, just to make sure that we create a better world for ourselves.
Well, it's a good reference tool, and frankly, I mean, the entire Human Rights Watch website, is divided country by country. So if people are interested in any country or any issue around the world, it's a good place to go.